On May 21st, 1998, a 15-year-old student, whom most classmates couldn't even remember by name, walked into the Thurston High School cafeteria. Under a long trench coat, he was hiding a semi-automatic rifle. And this quiet, inconspicuous guy, who never caused trouble and always sat somewhere in the back rows, would open fire on his own classmates just a few minutes later. But to understand how he reached this point, one must go back a bit and understand who Kip Kinkel really was and why no one around him noticed what was happening. Springfield, Oregon, is a small town in the Willamette River Valley, right next to Eugene. Sawmills, farms, a solid middle class, and an atmosphere where neighbors know each other and doors aren't locked until late at night. Thurston High was a typical American school, with a football field, student parking, and a cafeteria with long tables where 1,500 teenagers gathered every day. Some were on the cheerleading squad, some did wrestling, and some just sat through classes waiting for graduation. And among all those 1,500 was one guy, Kip Kinkel, a freshman, 15 years old, short and thin, wearing baggy clothes that made him even more invisible. He wasn't an outcast, because outcasts are at least noticed. He wasn't a star, because stars are remembered. Kip was something in between, a shadow on the periphery, a person you see every day in the hallway and yet cannot recall his face. Teachers would later say he was polite, quiet, and never caused any problems. Classmates would remember something along the lines of, yes, there was a guy like that. He sat somewhere in the back. And a neighbor down the street would just shrug and say he was the son of those lovely teachers. And it is important to understand that from the outside, the Kinkel family looked absolutely exemplary. The father, Bill, taught Spanish first at the same Thurston High, then moved to a college. The mother, Faith, was also a Spanish teacher, but at a neighboring school. They met at work, got married, and raised 2 children. The eldest daughter, Kristen, went away to study, smart, successful, everything as it should be. And Kip stayed home. The youngest, the one who didn't catch on quickly, who was held back in the 1st grade, for whom they hired tutors and took to specialists. But only the parents knew all of this. To everyone else, he remained just the quiet guy, the kind found in every school. He sits in the corner, doesn't raise his hand, doesn't go to parties. Not bad, not good, just nothing. As his best friend Tony McCown would later say in an interview, yes, Kip had problems, but he didn't stand out. There are many like him. They just exist. The front door of the house on Chacamac Drive turned out to be unlocked. Police arrived there to inform the parents of the news that their son had been arrested, that he had opened fire at the school, and that there were casualties. A quiet neighborhood, well-kept lawns, cars in garages, everything looked absolutely normal. The officers knocked on the door, but there was only silence in response. They called the owners by name. No answer. And then they stepped inside. Bill Kinkel lay on the kitchen floor face down, right by the counter. A shot to the back of the head from close range, almost point blank. Next to him stood a cold cup of coffee, as if he hadn't even had time to realize what was happening. Faith was found in the basement. She lay on the floor, covered by a sheet, and later they would count 6 gunshot wounds on her body. Someone had carefully smoothed out the fabric and covered her face. And this moment with the sheet is something investigators would later analyze separately because there was something simultaneously eerie and strangely human about it. Medical examiners established the time of death, and it pointed to the evening of May 20th, which was 15 to 16 hours before the school shooting. The chronology of events was established almost immediately. On the afternoon of May 20th, Kip was detained right at school because a stolen pistol was found in his locker. He was expelled, and his parents were called. His father arrived, picked up his son from the police station, and brought him home. And that same evening, shots rang out in the house. First the father died, then the mother, and then Kip was left all alone. An entire night in an empty house where his father lay in the kitchen and his mother lay under a sheet in the basement. What was he doing all that time? Was he sleeping, walking through the rooms, sitting and preparing for what would happen in the morning? No one will ever know for sure. But on the morning of May 21st, he put on his long trench coat, took a rifle, 2 pistols, and a knife, got into his mother's car, and drove to school. As the investigation would later establish, he knew exactly what he was doing and was acting according to a specific plan of his own. So, if you count it up, 4 people died in 20 hours, 2 at home, in total silence, with no witnesses, 2 in the school cafeteria, in front of hundreds of people. And between these 2 points was a night that a 15-year-old teenager spent in the same house with the bodies of those he had just shot. Bill and Faith Kinkel were teachers. They had dedicated their lives to working with other people's teenagers. And to their own son, especially their own son, they gave everything they could. They hired tutors, took him to specialists, and tried to help him cope with his learning difficulties. And yet, they were the ones who became his first victims. Bill and Faith Kinkel were the kind of parents who didn't back down or give up, even when everything wasn't going according to plan. And to understand why what happened was such a shock to everyone around them, one must understand what kind of family this was and what they had gone through in the years leading up to that terrible May. Bill grew up in California, learned Spanish, fell in love with teaching, and at some point moved to Oregon. In Springfield, he got a job at Thurston High, where he taught Spanish and coached the school tennis team. Colleagues would later remember him as a calm and patient person, the kind who never raised his voice, even when there was a reason to. Faith came from a family of Polish immigrants. Her maiden name was Zuransky. She also taught Spanish, but at the neighboring Springfield High. They met at some teachers' conference, got married, and bought that very house on Chacamac Drive, where the tragedy would later occur. Their first child was a daughter, Kristen, a smart, capable girl who picked up everything literally on the fly. By high school, she already knew for sure that she would go to study abroad, and she did indeed go, later staying there and building a successful career. Everything as it should be, everything according to plan. But 6 years after Kristen, Kip arrived, and with him, everything was different from the very beginning. When Kip turned 6, the family went to Spain for a whole year because Bill had a sabbatical. Kristen acclimated there almost instantly, but Kip never spoke Spanish until the very end of the trip. Teachers at the local school noted that he didn't engage in the process, didn't understand what was happening around him, and was noticeably lagging behind the other children. When the family returned to Oregon and Kip entered the 1st grade, Teachers recommended he be held back a year because he was immature, developing slowly, and couldn't keep up with the curriculum. The parents agreed. Later, he was diagnosed with dyslexia. Then began the tutors, special classes, and endless visits to various specialists. And here, it is important to understand that Bill and Faith did not back down. They didn't send their son to a boarding school. They didn't wave it off. They didn't tell themselves that he would eventually outgrow it. They were constantly looking for ways to help him, trying different approaches, paying for doctors and consultants. Neighbors saw a perfectly ordinary family. 2 working parents, a well-kept house, polite teenagers. None of them even suspected how much effort actually went into making everything look normal. So Kip grew up in the constant shadow of his older sister, and with each passing year, it became clearer that something was wrong. That something inside him worked completely differently. Dyslexia in itself is not a death sentence. Millions of people live with it perfectly normally and achieve success. But for Kip, it became the first link in a long chain of problems that only accumulated over time. Reading was true torture for him. Letters jumped before his eyes, words fell apart, and what came easily to others was forced for him. Kristen brought home A's one after another, while he sat over his homework for 3 hours and ended up with C's. Teachers told the parents the same thing. He tries, but he can't keep up. Bill and Faith hired tutors, and that helped, but not for long. The effect quickly wore off. By middle school, Kip finally found something he was better at than others. Only it wasn't reading, sports, or music. It was destruction. First came firecrackers, the ordinary store-bought kind you can find in any shop. Then he moved on to homemade ones because the internet already existed by then, and finding instructions wasn't difficult. Jars of chemicals, wires, and fuses began to appear in the garage, and all of this gradually turned into his personal laboratory. Once, he and a friend blew something up in an old quarry outside of town, and the roar of the explosion was heard for a mile. The parents found out. There was a serious conversation, punishment, and a ban on leaving the house for a whole month. But what is important to understand is that the interest didn't disappear. It just went deeper and became less noticeable to those around him. Parallel to this, Kip developed another passion: knives. He began to collect a whole collection, folding, hunting, tactical, of various sizes and shapes. The parents didn't forbid it because their reasoning was simple. It's not a firearm, it's just a hobby, like many boys have. In his room hung a special board with blades, and guess who saw it would only shrug and say something like, "Boys will be boys. What can you expect from them?" But Bill and Faith still noticed that something was wrong with their son, and they took him to a psychologist. He conducted tests, talked with Kip, and wrote a conclusion in which he noted a tendency toward aggression and recommended anger management. He scheduled regular sessions. Kip attended them for several months and then simply stopped, and for some reason, the parents did not insist on continuing. So, when he turned 12, his fascination with weapons stopped being just a hobby and began to turn into something else entirely, a true obsession that only intensified with each passing year. 12 is the age when firecrackers no longer impress, and you want something more serious. And it was then that Kip began to talk about weapons constantly, literally at every opportunity. Which calibers were better for different purposes, what the recoil was for different models, how the automation worked in semi-automatic rifles. Classmates would later recall that he could talk about all this for hours, as if no other topics for conversation existed. In a rhetoric class, when it was necessary to choose a topic for a presentation, Kip chose the instructions for assembling a bomb. The teacher didn't stop him because he considered it a manifestation of freedom of speech and a research approach. Kip explained everything in detail in front of the whole class. The classmates laughed, and the teacher gave him a good grade. And this moment would later be analyzed separately, because it was one of those signals that everyone missed. At home, meanwhile, the knife collection continued to grow. Catalogues from gun shops appeared, along with posters of military equipment on the walls. Kip told his friends that he wanted to join the army after school and that he wanted to know what it was like to shoot someone. The parents heard this, but dismissed it as typical teenage posturing, because boys at that age often say foolish things to seem cool to their peers. But Bill Kinkel still understood that his son was obsessed with this topic and that it wouldn't go away on its own. Something had to be done. And then he made a decision that, at the time, seemed absolutely right to him. For Christmas, Kip received a single-shot .22 caliber rifle as a gift, his father's old one. Bill had once received it as a child from his own father, and now he was passing this family relic to his son. The logic was simple. If an obsession cannot be stopped, then it must be led, taken under control, made legal and safe so that everything happened under supervision, rather than in quarries outside of town. They began to go to the shooting range together, father and son. Bill taught the correct grip, safe handling of weapons, and discipline on the firing line. He sincerely hoped that he had finally found a way to reach Kip, to find common ground through this shared activity. As it turned out, one rifle was not enough for long. Very soon, Kip wanted more, and stopping that process proved impossible. Bill Kinkel was not a naive man. In 30 years of working with teenagers, he had seen all sorts: difficult, withdrawn, aggressive, the kind other teachers simply brushed off. He knew perfectly well that direct bans usually don't work, and understood that a head-on collision with an obsession only strengthens it and drives it deeper. That is precisely why he chose a completely different path. Psychologist Jeffrey Hicks, who was treating Kip at the time, supported the idea. Faith initially doubted it, because having a weapon in a house with a teenager with obvious problems seemed like a bad idea to her. But Hicks explained his logic. Give him a legal outlet for this energy. Turn a dangerous fascination into a controlled hobby. The father will be there. Rules will be established. Everything happens under supervision. And in this way, you can direct this interest into a safe channel. Faith listened to the arguments and eventually agreed. And the next 2 years did indeed look almost normal. Kip and Bill went to the range on weekends, spent time there together, and from the outside, it seemed like a typical father-son activity. The father patiently explained safety techniques, storage, rules, and Oregon state laws regarding ownership and use. Kip listened attentively, followed all instructions, and did not violate the established agreements. Bill gradually began to believe that he had finally found the key to his son that he had been searching for so long. For the first time in years, they had a real common interest. Kip talked to his father, asked for his advice, and looked forward to the weekend trips together. It was much more than just a hobby. It was a bridge between them, the first real connection that worked. But here is what Bill did not know. He only saw what happened beside him: the range, paper targets, cleaning the weapons together after practice. But what Kip did the rest of the time, when his father wasn't around, remained completely in the shadows. Conversations with friends became darker with each passing month. The fantasies he shared became more concrete and detailed. Internet searches became increasingly specific, and if anyone had looked into his browser history, they would have seen things that should have caused serious concern. So the single-shot rifle was no longer enough for Kip. He wanted more, and this desire only grew. By the spring of '98, 4 firearms were kept in Kip's room. That same single-shot rifle he received as a gift from his father for Christmas, a semi-automatic Ruger 10/22, which Bill bought later after Kip proved he could handle weapons responsibly and follow all safety rules, and 2 pistols, a 9mm Glock 19 and a .22 caliber Ruger, both acquired without any knowledge of his parents. And that wasn't all. Plus, there were the knives, the same collection hanging on the board in his room in plain sight. Plus, the homemade explosive devices he hid in the garage, away from his parents' eyes. So, Bill and Faith only knew about the 2 rifles. This was legal. It was agreed upon between them, and the weapons were kept in a special safe, although Kip had free access to it. As for everything else, they either didn't know or perhaps simply didn't want to know, because then they would have to admit that the situation had spun out of control. He bought the Glock from a classmate who had stolen the pistol from the father of a friend. The deal took place right at school, in the parking lot in broad daylight. $300 in cash. Kip brought the money from home. The second pistol appeared in much the same way, through acquaintances of acquaintances. Teenagers in Springfield quickly found out. Kinkel buys weapons, and Kinkel pays well, without haggling or deception. Real hiding spots were set up in his room. A false bottom in a closet that he made himself. A box under the bed pushed into the farthest corner. Space behind a bookshelf where anything could be hidden. His parents periodically entered his room, saw the posters on the walls and the computer on the desk, but they didn't check the corners, look into the hiding spots, or ask unnecessary questions. Perhaps they believed everything was under control. Perhaps it simply never occurred to them that their 15-year-old son was capable of leading such a double life. By May of '98, this teenager had gathered an arsenal that would have sufficed for a small siege. 4 firearms, a collection of knives, homemade explosives in the garage. All of this lay waiting for its hour, just a few meters from the bedroom of parents who wished him good night every evening and had no suspicion of what was actually happening. And then he was finally caught. On May 20th, the day before the shooting. But he wasn't caught with the weapons that would truly cause for concern, and not for anything that could have revealed the full scale of what he was preparing. A tip came from another student on the morning of May 20th, exactly 1 day before what would happen in the cafeteria. One of the students heard that Kinkel had brought a gun to school and reported it to the administration. Vice Principal Don Stone, who was also a football coach, immediately called security, and they went together to Kip's locker. Inside lay a loaded .32 caliber Beretta, the very stolen pistol he had once bought in the school parking lot. Kip was taken out of class right in the middle of a lesson. And on the way to the administration office, he inconspicuously threw something into a trash can. Stone noticed this, stopped, and checked. It turned out to be a switchblade. Another piece of evidence, another proof that this quiet guy was walking around the school armed. The police were called, and he was handcuffed. Stone would later recall in an interview, "I look into his eyes and see nothing there, just emptiness, no fear, no remorse." Kip asked him in a flat voice, without the slightest panic, "Coach, what's going to happen to me now?" And this question sounded so mundane, as if they were talking about a missed practice rather than a criminal case. He was taken to the station and booked as a juvenile. He was expelled from school with a formal right to appeal, but everyone understood perfectly well that there would be no appeal. Weapons on school grounds. That is the end. The line after which there is no way back. Bill arrived to pick up his son from the station. He signed all the necessary papers, put Kip in the car, and they were silent all the way home. Not a word during the entire trip. But at home, a conversation began. And it was a completely different conversation than the ones they had before. No one knows the details of this conversation, for sure, because both participants are dead. But neighbors later said they heard shouting from the Kinkel house that evening. Bill lost his temper very rarely. For all those years, he was known as a calm and restrained person. But that evening, a breakdown finally happened. Years of effort, therapy, trips to the range, the trust built with such difficulty, all of it collapsed in one day because of a loaded pistol in a school locker. Kip now faced juvenile court and a very real sentence in a correctional facility. Essentially, it was the end of a normal life, the end of all those plans his parents had built for him despite everything. That evening, when the shouting died down and the house sank into silence, Bill sat down in the kitchen. He sat with his back to the door, drinking coffee and probably trying to figure out what to do next. How to get out of this situation, if anything, could still be saved. So, he didn't hear his son quietly enter the room behind him. And those were the last minutes of his life. Though he didn't even suspect it, the shot to the back of the head rang out at about 6 o'clock in the evening, from a distance of a few steps. Bill fell to the kitchen floor without even having time to realize what had happened. The cup with unfinished coffee remained standing on the counter, as if he had just stepped out for a minute and would return shortly. Kip dragged his father's body to the wall and covered it with something. The police would later find a sheet there, similar to the one he would later use to cover his mother in the basement. After that, he simply sat down and began to wait. Faith returned from work around 7 in the evening. She entered through the garage, as she had done every day for many years, and called for her husband. In response, there was only silence. She walked further toward the kitchen, and that was when Kip opened fire. 6 shots, 2 of which hit her head and 4 of which hit her body. Faith fell in the hallway, never reaching the kitchen where her husband lay. After that, Kip waited again for some time. Then he went downstairs, took his mother's body, and carried it to the basement. He laid it on the floor, covered it with a sheet, and carefully smoothed out the edges of the fabric, covering her face. Investigators would later analyze this moment separately, because there was something simultaneously eerie and strangely human about it. A final gesture of care from a person who had just committed a murder. And then, standing over his mother's body in the basement, he spoke 3 words aloud. He would tell this later in court. "I love you." He said it and went upstairs. Ahead was an entire night. 2 corpses lay in the house, one in the kitchen, the other in the basement. And outside the window, a typical Springfield evening continued. Neighbors mowed lawns, dogs barked at squirrels, cars drove by somewhere. None of those living nearby even suspected what was happening in the house on Chacamac Drive. What exactly Kip was doing during those 12 hours, the investigation never established for certain. It is only known that he did not sleep. This is evident from the activity logs on his computer. He listened to music, checked his weapons, and prepared his gear for the morning. Perhaps he simply walked through the rooms and thought about what would happen tomorrow. Perhaps he sat and stared at a single point. No one will ever know. On the morning of May 21st, he put on that same long trench coat, under which he hid 2 holsters with pistols, pouches with spare ammunition, and a knife on his belt. He took his father's semi-automatic rifle, the very one Bill had once bought for him as a sign of trust. He got into his mother's car, started the engine, and drove to school, to that same Thurston High from which he had been expelled just yesterday. And it was there, in the school cafeteria before the first lesson, that the story which began as a family drama would turn into a mass murder. May 21st, Thursday, a clear morning. The temperature was rising toward 20 degrees Celsius. A typical school day, like hundreds in Springfield before it and hundreds after. Kip parked his mother's car in the student parking lot, in the same spot where he always parked, and stepped outside. No one paid much attention to him, because who knows who might arrive at school in the morning. Maybe someone was just picking up their things from their locker after an expulsion. He entered the building through the main entrance and walked down the hallway toward the cafeteria. The long trench coat hid everything underneath, and from the outside, he looked like just another teenager in baggy clothes. The time was 5 to 8. Only 5 minutes remained until the first lesson, and the cafeteria was packed to capacity. About 400 people were in one room at the same time. Some stood in line for breakfast, some sat at long tables, some crowded around soda machines. And then, Kip stopped at the entrance to the cafeteria. He unbuttoned his coat, took out the rifle, and raised it. Whether the first shot was aimed at the ceiling or directly into the crowd, witnesses would later differ in their testimony. But within a second, it became clear to everyone that this was not a prank or someone's stupid joke. He fired aimed shots, moving from the entrance deeper into the hall, methodically, step by step. Round after round, 50 shots from the magazine. At some point, he reloaded, and he did it calmly, without haste, exactly the way he had done at the shooting range with his father during their trips together. All the skills Bill had so diligently instilled in him were now working against innocent people. And here is what is important to understand. This was not an emotional breakdown. There were no screams, no tears, no manifesto shouted into the crowd. He was simply performing a task, methodically and with focus, as if he had been training specifically for this moment for many years. To those watching, it looked eerie precisely because of that calm. because of the total absence of any visible emotion on his face. When the ammunition finally ran out, he threw the rifle onto the floor and reached for the pistol on his belt. But he didn't have time to draw it because at that exact moment, Jacob Riker, who already had a bullet in his chest, stood up and tackled him. 2 other boys followed. Together, they pinned Kip to the floor and knocked the knife he had managed to grab out of his hand. Kip did not resist. He just lay on the tile floor and stared at the ceiling as if it were all over, and he didn't care what happened next. When the police arrived and officers approached him, he said only one phrase: "Just shoot me." But they didn't shoot him. He was arrested, handcuffed, taken to the station, and interrogated. And then he was sent to trial. And that was when the world first heard about what had actually been going on in his head all those years, and it turned out to be more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The Kip Kinkel case immediately became national news because America had never seen anything like it. 4 bodies, a 15-year-old shooter, a model family of teachers who themselves became the first victims of their own son. Columbine would happen only a year later, and then Springfield would gradually be forgotten against the backdrop of an even larger tragedy. But in May 1998, cameras stood by the courthouse from early morning, and journalists from across the country spent nights in motels along the highway because hotel rooms in the city had run out in the very first days. The prosecution demanded that Kip be tried as an adult. 4 counts of first-degree murder plus 26 counts of attempted murder. And Oregon state law, indeed, allowed such a reclassification for minors in special cases. And this case was more than special. In response, the defense began to build its strategy around insanity. The lawyers hired psychiatrists, collected all available medical records, and prepared an entire team of experts to testify in court. And it was here that something came to light, which became perhaps the most important moment of the entire process. Kip had been examined by psychiatrists even before the crime, not just after it. Psychologist Jeffrey Hicks, the same specialist who once approved the idea of buying weapons and joint trips to the shooting range, had seen Kip for nearly a full year. He diagnosed him with major depressive disorder. He prescribed Prozac, one of the standard first-line antidepressants. Kip took these pills for several months, and for a while it seemed they were helping. And then he just stopped taking them. The prescription ran out, and he didn't renew it. His parents either didn't notice or failed to monitor him properly. So by the spring of 1998, he had been completely off medication for several months, and none of the adults knew about it. But that wasn't the whole diagnosis, nor the full picture of what was happening to Kip. Hicks noted in his records that the patient was secretive, reluctant to talk about his internal experiences, and that there might be symptoms he was intentionally not disclosing during sessions. The psychologist recommended continuing observation and not stopping therapy. The parents agreed, but gradually the sessions became less and less frequent until they stopped altogether. New experts testified at the trial, those brought in after the crime for a full psychiatric evaluation. Their conclusion turned out to be significantly harsher than anything heard before. Paranoid schizophrenia, auditory hallucinations, delusions of persecution. In their opinion, Kip had been hearing voices long before that May Day, and it was these voices that ultimately ordered him to do what he did. But the defense never got the chance to bring this case to a jury and present all their arguments. Because at some point, Kip made his own decision. He wanted to speak for himself, to tell his own version of what was going on in his head. And what he told changed the understanding of the entire case. Kip Kinkel's testimony spanned 40 pages of transcript. A monotone voice, long pauses between sentences, answers to the psychiatrist's questions that sounded as if he were talking about someone else rather than himself. It was from this testimony that the world learned what completely overturned the understanding of this whole story. He began hearing voices when he was 12 years old. At first, it was just a whisper, indecipherable, like radio static, as if someone were trying to break through the interference. Later, the words became clearer, and he began to understand exactly what they were saying to him. The voices repeated that he was a nobody, that everyone around him hated him, that he was ugly, stupid, and disgusting, that the world would be much better off without him, and that he didn't deserve to live. And here is what's important. Kip told no one about this. He was afraid he would be locked in a psychiatric hospital and never get out. He was afraid his parents would renounce him if they knew the truth. He was afraid everyone around him would call him crazy and look at him like a freak. So he kept silent and tried to cope with it alone. By the age of 14, the voices changed. They stopped just insulting him and began to give orders. Not just saying nasty things, but commanding specific actions. Kill the cat, hit a classmate, take a knife, hurt someone. Kip resisted these orders, quite successfully at first. He simply didn't do what he was told. But with each passing month, it became harder and harder. The voices became louder and more persistent. When the sessions with psychologist Hicks began, Kip told him part of the truth. He spoke about his anger, about fantasies of violence, about the desire to hurt someone. But he kept silent about the voices, not saying a word. Hicks didn't ask about it directly, and Kip didn't confess on his own because he was still afraid of being considered insane. Prozac actually helped, but not for long. While Kip was taking the pills, the voices became significantly quieter. The commands occurred less frequently, and he had a few months of almost normal life. He even began to think that maybe everything would work out. And then he stopped taking the medicine. The prescription ran out, and he simply didn't renew it. The voices returned louder than ever before, and now they said very specific things. Kill your parents? They already know about you. They see that something is wrong with you, and they will definitely hand you over to the doctors. You'll be locked in a hospital forever, and you'll never get out. And the voices also said, go to school. Everyone who laughed at you is there. Everyone who didn't notice you and pretended you didn't exist is there. Go and show them all. To the psychiatrist's question about why his parents became the first victims, Kip answered without the slightest pause. The voices said, I had to do it. I loved them, and I had to kill them. Exactly like that. In those words, without any attempt to explain or justify himself. And this combination of love and murder in one sentence became, perhaps, the most chilling moment of the entire trial. After Kip's testimony, the defense presented a detailed chronology to the court. But it wasn't a chronology of his life. It was a chronology of the entire system that theoretically should have stopped him long before that May morning. And when all these facts were laid out, one after another, the picture turned out to be truly frightening. His parents knew about the problem since childhood. Dyslexia, developmental delay, outbursts of aggression, a growing obsession with weapons. All this was known to them for many years. They took their son to specialists, paid for therapy, tried to control the situation and direct his interests into safe channels. They did what they could within their understanding of the problem. Psychologist Jeffrey Hicks saw Kip for 9 months. He diagnosed depression, prescribed antidepressants, and noted in his records that the patient was secretive and reluctant to talk about internal experiences. But at the same time, he didn't dig deeper, didn't ask direct questions about hallucinations or voices, and it was he who approved the idea of buying a weapon as a kind of therapeutic tool to build the relationship between father and son. The school also knew quite a lot. It knew about Kip's interest in explosives because he gave a report on the subject right in a rhetoric class. It knew about his talk of violence because classmates periodically told teachers about it. And finally, the school found out about the knife and the loaded pistol in his locker, after which it expelled him. But this happened only one day before the shooting, when it was already too late. The police detained Kip on May 20th, filed a juvenile report, and released him into his parents' custody. At the same time, no one went to check the house. No one confiscated the legal weapons stored there. No one assigned any supervision or monitoring for a teenager who had just been found with a loaded gun at school. And here's what happened. Every element of the system did its part and passed the responsibility further down the chain. The parents sent their son to a psychologist. The psychologist sent him back to the parents with recommendations. The school reported it to the police. The police returned the teenager back to the family. None of them connected all these dots. No one saw the whole picture because everyone looked only at their own individual fragment. The prosecutor at trial asked the expert a direct question. Could this tragedy have been prevented? The expert answered honestly. Under the existing system, most likely not. Different people had the information, but it didn't circulate among them. It wasn't gathered into a single whole. The defense used all this as an argument for insanity. The system knew about the problems and didn't stop him, so the guilt is systemic. The prosecution used the same facts as an argument against him. The system gave the defendant many chances to reform, but he himself didn't take any of them. There was no jury at this trial because Kip pleaded guilty before the main hearings began. The judge listened to the arguments of both sides, examined all the evidence presented, and looked at the defendant sitting before him. Then, he asked him to say his final words, and the courtroom froze in anticipation of what a 15-year-old murderer of 4 people would say. Kip spoke for 20 minutes, without notes, without a prepared speech, just looking at the table in front of him and saying what was inside him. He said, "I knew what I was doing. The voices told me it was the only way out of the situation I was in. I believed them. I shouldn't have believed them, but I did because they were louder than everything else." He said, "I loved my parents. They did absolutely everything they could for me. They didn't give up and didn't back down, even when it was hard. And I shot them because the voices said they would betray me, that they would hand me over to doctors and I'd be locked in a hospital forever." He said, "When I came to the school, I wanted to be stopped. I wanted someone to shoot back and for all this to end. I couldn't do it myself. The voices forbade me from stopping, but I wanted someone else to do it for me. And he also said, now the voices are gone. The pills work, and I finally hear silence. And in this silence, there is only one thing: what I did. And it's impossible to forget. The judge listened to him until the end, and then read the sentence. 111 years and 8 months of imprisonment without the right to parole. 4 life sentences, stacked consecutively, one after another. At the time of the sentencing, Kip was only 15 years old. He was taken to the Oregon State Correctional Institution, and he remains there to this day. He is now 42 years old, and he has outlived everyone he killed that day. His sister, Kristen, pays for his appeals from their parents' insurance and visits him every few months. When a journalist asked her why she does this after everything that happened, she answered simply, "He's my brother. He was sick, and the system didn't save him." Thurston High School still stands in the same place in Springfield. A memorial has been installed at the entrance. 25 white tiles in memory of the wounded, and 2 black tiles for those who died. The names of Mikael Nicolason and Ben Walker are carved in stone so they are not forgotten. Every year on May 21st, the survivors gather there, although the numbers dwindle each year. Some moved to another city, some simply cannot bring themselves to return there again, but some still come. After the tragedy, Springfield took the slogan, "Let it end here." But it didn't end. 11 months later, Columbine happened, then Virginia Tech, then Sandy Hook, then Parkland, and the list continues to grow every year. Kip Kinkel watches the news in the prison common room and sees hauntingly familiar footage. A school, police cordons, stretchers, crying parents at the fence. And every time this happens, the same question arises, the very one asked after Springfield and to which no answer has ever been received. How many such teenagers are sitting in classrooms across the country right now? How many of them hear voices and tell no one? How many parents notice warning signs but don't understand what they mean? How many systems have the information but don't act because everyone sees only their own fragment? There is no answer to these questions. There are only the next news reports and the next names on memorial plaques. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. It helps with promotion. Write in the comments what you think about all this. See you in the next video.